It's strange how you can fall into routine when your job is to pull apart other people's lives. I've been a private investigator for years, and I've become used to the mundane side of human depravity, catching people cheating on their spouses, digging up dirt on business partners. It's usually the same story with different faces. But every once in a while, you get a case that throws everything you think you know about the world into chaos. This is one of those cases, one that still makes me question how deep human darkness can really go. It began like any other day at my office, a dingy little space on the edge of town. I had just finished my third cup of coffee when the phone rang. A man named Greg Heller was on the other end. His voice was calm, almost too calm for what he was asking. "I need you to look into my wife," he said. "She's been acting strange." That wasn't an unusual request. Probably half of my clients were suspicious spouses. What caught my attention, though, was the way he said strange. There was something deeper behind that word, a hesitation I couldn't place. "I think she's been seeing someone else," Greg continued, "but it's more than that. She's disappearing for hours at a time, and when she comes home, she's different." "Different how?" I asked, curiosity piqued. "She doesn't talk much, doesn't respond when I ask her where she's been. It's like she's not even really there." I jotted down some notes, already forming an idea of what might be going on. Drugs, maybe, or some kind of mental health issue. But I didn't say that to Greg. "I'll take the case," I told him. "Send me any details you think I'll need. Addresses, her daily routine, any other information you've got." Greg didn't waste time. Within an hour, I had an email with photos of his wife, Emily, her work schedule, and the usual places she went. She was a school teacher, and from what I could see, her life seemed ordinary. There was nothing in the background check that raised any alarms. No criminal record, no history of mental illness, no sign of financial trouble. It all seemed too clean. The next day, I started following Emily. She was in her early 30s, slim with long brown hair that she kept tied up in a ponytail. She looked exactly like the kind of person you'd expect to find teaching elementary school kids. Sweet and unassuming. But as soon as I began tailing her, I noticed something off. Greg hadn't exaggerated when he said she disappeared for hours at a time. Every day after work, she'd drive to the outskirts of town, park her car in an empty lot near an old industrial building, and vanish. The first time I stayed in my car watching from a distance. She walked into the building, a large warehouse that had clearly been abandoned for years. There were no other cars around, no signs of life, yet she was inside for hours. When she finally emerged, it was late, and the air had taken on that cool, sharp bite of the evening. She walked back to her car in the same trance-like state she had entered with. Her eyes glazed over, her expression blank. I followed her home, but she didn't make any stops along the way. She went straight inside and didn't come out again for the rest of the night. I watched the house for a few more hours, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The next day, I was determined to dig deeper. I arrived early before she left work and decided to check out the building she'd been visiting. It was a massive, decrepit warehouse with rusted metal doors and shattered windows, the kind of place that looked like it should have been condemned years ago. I forced one of the side doors open and slipped inside. The interior was even worse than I expected. Graffiti covered the walls, and the floor was littered with old furniture, broken machinery, and empty bottles. There were no lights, just thin shafts of sunlight leaking through cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the room. I moved through the space quietly, trying to find any clue as to what Emily had been doing here. It didn't take long to find something disturbing. In one corner of the warehouse, hidden behind a stack of crates, was a makeshift room walled off with plywood. Inside were several old mattresses covered in dirty blankets and a few wooden chairs arranged in a circle. But what really caught my attention were the photographs. They were pinned to the walls, dozens of them, all of Emily. Some of them were recent, showing her walking to her car, sitting at her desk at work, even standing in front of her house. But others were older, much older. They showed Emily as a teenager, and some even went back to what looked like her childhood. She was in different settings, at school, at family gatherings, in her backyard. Whoever had taken these photos had been watching her for years. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just some random stalking. Someone had been tracking Emily's entire life, documenting her every move. But why? I snapped a few photos of the room with my phone, then quickly left the warehouse. The more I thought about it, the more I was sure that Emily had no idea this was happening. If she had, she would have gone to the police by now. But there was one thing I couldn't figure out. Why did she keep coming back to this place? Was she being coerced? Or was there something else going on? Something I hadn't yet uncovered? That night, I made the decision to confront her. I waited until she returned home, then approached her as she got out of her car. Her eyes widened when she saw me, but she didn't seem frightened, just confused. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "I'm a private investigator," I said, showing her my badge. "Your husband hired me. He's worried about you." Her face darkened at the mention of Greg, but she didn't say anything. I pressed on. "I know about the warehouse," I said. "I've seen the photos. Whoever's behind this has been watching you for years." Her expression didn't change. She just stared at me as if the words hadn't registered. "I need to know why you keep going there," I said, lowering my voice. "Is someone threatening you?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally she spoke. "I go there because I have to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have a choice." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" After watching me, she said, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone might be listening. "They've always been watching me." "Who?" I asked, stepping closer. She shook her head. "I don't know. I don't know who they are, but they know everything about me. They know things I don't even remember, and they make me come to that place." "Make you?" I repeated. Emily hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "They send me videos," she said, "every week. Videos of me doing things I don't remember, things I would never do." My heart raced. "What kind of things?" Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She tapped a few buttons, then handed it to me. On the screen was a video, grainy and low quality, but clear enough to see Emily standing in a dark room. Her face was expressionless, and she was speaking, but the audio was distorted, and I couldn't make out the words. Then she started moving, her body jerking in unnatural, almost robotic motions. It was as if someone else was controlling her, like a puppet on strings. I watched in horror as the video continued. Emily approached a man tied to a chair. His face was bloodied and bruised, and he was sobbing, begging for his life. Without hesitation, Emily reached for a knife on a nearby table, and with cold precision, slit his throat. I felt bile rise in my throat as I handed the phone back to her. "I don't remember any of it," she said, her voice shaking. "But they send me these videos, and they tell me that if I don't keep going back to the warehouse, they'll show them to the police. They'll ruin my life." I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what I had just seen. This wasn't just a case of stalking or coercion. This was something far darker, far more twisted than I had ever imagined. "We need to go to the police," I said, my voice firm. But Emily shook her head. "They'll never believe me. They'll think I'm crazy, or worse, they'll arrest me for the things I don't even remember doing." She wasn't wrong. As a private investigator, I knew how hard it would be to prove any of this without solid evidence. And right now, all we had were videos that could easily be faked and a story that sounded like something out of a horror movie. But I couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. I promised her that I would help, that I would find out who was behind this and put a stop to it. The next day, I went back to the warehouse, determined to find more clues. I combed through every inch of the place, looking for anything that could lead me to whoever was pulling the strings. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized how careful they had been. There were no fingerprints, no security cameras, nothing that could point me in the right direction. Whoever these people were, they were professionals, and they were playing a game I wasn't sure I could win. As the weeks went by, I continued to investigate, but every lead turned into a dead end. Emily kept receiving the videos, each one more disturbing than the last. And every time she was forced to return to the warehouse, to the place that had become her prison. Then one day she disappeared. Greg called me frantic. He hadn't heard from her in days, and her phone was going straight to voicemail. I checked the warehouse, but it was empty. There was no sign of her, no sign of a struggle, nothing to suggest what had happened. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I spent months searching for her, but she was gone. The police eventually closed the case, labeling it a voluntary disappearance. But I knew better. Emily hadn't run away. She had been taken by the people who had been watching her for years. To this day, I still don't know who they are or why they targeted her. All I know is that they're out there and they're watching, and Emily wasn't the first. The first time I heard about the case was during a routine morning briefing at the precinct. A woman named Emily Clark had been reported missing by her husband, Greg. She had last been seen leaving work at a local marketing firm, and according to Greg, she never made it home. As a detective in the missing persons unit, I'd seen many cases like this. The majority ended up being temporary disappearances, often resolved with a simple phone call, but something about this case felt different. Emily was in her early 30s, a vibrant woman with a promising career ahead of her. She had recently been promoted, and everyone who knew her described her as responsible and organized. Her sudden disappearance raised alarm bells, and I was eager to dig deeper. I arrived at the Clark home that afternoon, where Greg was waiting for me. He was a tall man, looking worn and pale with deep circles under his eyes. I could see the fear etched into his features as he led me into their living room, which was filled with family photos of happier times. "Thank you for coming," Greg said, his voice trembling. "I just don't understand. She wouldn't just leave. She has so much going on." I nodded, my mind racing with questions. "Can you tell me about her day? Did anything seem off?" Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not really. She left work around 5, and I spoke to her just before then. She sounded fine, but when I got home at 6 o'clock, she wasn't here. I thought maybe she had gone for a run or was hanging out with friends. Did she mention any plans?" "No, she was just busy with work. I thought she might be staying late to finish a project." "Were there any problems at work? Any issues with colleagues?" Greg shook his head. "No, everyone liked her. She was well respected. It doesn't make sense." I took detailed notes as Greg spoke, carefully noting the timeline. I asked him for a description of what she was wearing when she left the house, and he struggled to remember. "I think it was a blue dress and a cardigan. She liked wearing that." The conversation drifted toward their relationship, and I sensed his frustration. "We're good, really. I mean, like any couple, we have our ups and downs, but nothing serious. She's my world. I can't lose her." His voice cracked, and I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. "I need her back." After the initial interview, I began gathering information from Emily's workplace. I learned that she had been working late on a big presentation and had been excited about the opportunity. Her co-workers were just as baffled by her disappearance, but one of them mentioned that Emily had seemed stressed lately. She had received a troubling email earlier that week, but no one had seen the contents. Did she mention anything about it to you? I asked her colleague, Sarah. No, but I know she was worried about it, Sarah replied, frowning. She said it was about some company policy change that might affect her position. She didn't go into details, though. As I left the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface. I decided to check Emily's social media accounts, searching for any clues or hints about her state of mind before she vanished. Her posts were cheerful, filled with pictures of her life, friends, family, and even her beloved dog. But as I scrolled deeper, I found a post from a few weeks back, a cryptic status that sent a chill down my spine. I feel like I'm being watched, it read, accompanied by a photo of her looking over her shoulder. There were no comments, just a few likes from her friends. I noted the date, wondering if it was related to her disappearance. That evening, I decided to visit the area around Emily's workplace, hoping to find someone who might have seen her that day. The streets were busy with commuters, and I stopped a few pedestrians to ask if they had noticed anything unusual. Most people were oblivious, caught up in their own lives, but one woman caught my attention. I saw her, she said, her eyes widening in recognition. I remember because she seemed distressed. She was talking on her phone, pacing back and forth outside the building. Did you see who she was talking to? I pressed, feeling a glimmer of hope. No, but I remember thinking it was strange. She was waving her arms around, looking agitated, the woman explained. Then she just walked away. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thanked her and made a note to check phone records, hoping the call might provide a lead. I also reached out to Greg, asking if Emily had mentioned any friends she might have been meeting. She didn't say anything, Greg replied, his voice thick with worry. But she has a friend named Rachel. They used to be close, but I know they haven't talked much lately. Maybe I should reach out to her. Do that, I encouraged, noting the name. Let me know if she mentions anything unusual. The following day, I continued my investigation by looking into Emily's phone records. I found that she had made a call to a number that belonged to a private investigator. My stomach dropped. Why would she contact a PI? But I decided to dig deeper into this angle, hoping it would lead to something substantial. I called the investigator's office, and a woman named Karen answered. Yes, Emily did reach out to us, she confirmed, but she never followed through with hiring us. What was the reason for her inquiry? I asked, feeling a sense of urgency. She was concerned about someone following her, Karen explained, her voice tinged with concern. She said she felt like she was being watched and wanted to know how to protect herself. But before she could make any decision, she stopped contacting us. Do you have any notes from your conversations? I pressed, trying to piece together Emily's state of mind. Let me check, Karen replied. After a moment, she returned to the line. I found some notes. She was very anxious, mentioning incidents where she felt someone was following her. She described seeing a man at her office and around her neighborhood. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Did she give you a description? Not really, just that he was tall and wore a dark hoodie. She said she felt uncomfortable, but she didn't think much of it at the time. I advised her to report it to the police, but it seemed she didn't. I thanked Karen and hung up, my mind racing. It was clear now that Emily's disappearance was connected to someone who had been stalking her. I rushed back to Greg's house, hoping to share what I'd found. Emily was scared, I said as I entered. She felt like she was being watched, and she reached out to a private investigator. Greg's face paled. What? Why didn't she tell me? I think she was trying to protect you from worrying, I suggested. She might have felt it was safer to handle this on her own. But she should have come to me, he exclaimed, frustration mingling with fear. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Right now, we need to focus on finding her. I'll look into any surveillance footage from the area around her workplace to see if we can spot this man. I spent the next few days poring over hours of footage, searching for any sign of Emily or the man she described. After a long, grueling process, I finally found a clip that caught my attention. In the corner of the frame, a tall figure in a dark hoodie lingered outside the office building, watching as Emily walked out. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it confirmed my worst fears. Someone had been stalking her. I sent the footage to Greg, and we both agreed that we needed to release it to the public, hoping someone might recognize the man. We organized a press conference, and I stood in front of the cameras, describing Emily's disappearance and urging anyone with information to come forward. Within hours, tips began flooding in. Most were dead ends, but one stood out. A woman claimed she had seen a man matching the description near an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I followed up on the lead, gathering the team to search the area. The warehouse was dark and decrepit, a haunting reminder of a forgotten past. As we approached, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Inside, the air was stale, and the sound of our footsteps echoed eerily against the walls. I led the team through the dimly lit corridors, our flashlights illuminating the crumbling interior. I felt a sense of dread growing as we moved deeper into the building. Then we found something that made my blood run cold. In one of the back rooms, we discovered a makeshift living space. Blankets, food wrappers, and a small stack of Emily's belongings. My heart raced as I recognized a bracelet she had worn. This was a sign that she had been here. We searched the area thoroughly, hoping to find any clues that might lead us to her. But it was as if the shadows had swallowed her whole. There was no sign of Emily, and I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness wash over me. Just as we were about to leave, one of my colleagues found a small notebook hidden beneath the floorboards. I opened it cautiously, my hands trembling. It was filled with notes, scribbled thoughts that hinted at someone's twisted obsession. She's perfect, just out of reach. I need to know more about her. Why does she seem happy? I can't let her go. The chilling words sent a wave of nausea through me. This wasn't just a stalker. It was an obsession. I took photos of the notebook and collected all the evidence, determined to find Emily and bring her back home. Back at the precinct, I shared the findings with my team, and we worked tirelessly to trace the notes back to any possible suspects. After hours of digging, we found a name that sent chills down my spine. Mark Reynolds, a former employee at Emily's company who had been let go due to inappropriate behavior. The pieces started to fit together. Mark had been keeping tabs on her, and his obsession had escalated to a dangerous level. We pulled up his records, and I learned that he had a history of stalking and harassment. With this information in hand, I put together a team to locate him. We staked out his apartment, and after several hours, he finally emerged. A tall man with a disheveled appearance, wearing the same dark hoodie Emily had described. We surrounded him. I shouted, and my team moved in quickly. We apprehended him without resistance, and I could see the panic in his eyes as we cuffed him. "Where is she?" I demanded, my voice cold and firm. Mark just stared at me, a smirk creeping across his face. "You'll never find her." I felt rage boiling inside me. "What have you done?" He laughed softly, shaking his head. "She wanted to be free. I gave her what she wanted." His words sent a chill down my spine. I had seen enough of his kind to know that he wasn't just a stalker. He was a predator. We brought him in for questioning, and I made sure to press him hard. "You're going to tell us where Emily is. You don't have a choice." But Mark remained tight-lipped, his smug demeanor infuriating. I knew we had to find evidence to tie him to her disappearance, so we searched his apartment for anything that could lead us to her location. Inside, we found more disturbing evidence. Photographs of Emily, taken from afar, her routines documented meticulously. It was clear he had been stalking her for a long time. While we searched, one of my colleagues found a hidden compartment in his closet, revealing a bag filled with Emily's personal items. Her purse, clothes, and even her phone. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized the implication. "Where is she?" I yelled, grabbing Mark by the collar. He smiled, a twisted satisfaction in his eyes. "You'll never know." Frustrated and desperate, I called for backup to search the area surrounding his apartment, hoping to find some sign of Emily. As we canvassed the neighborhood, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. We were running out of time. With each passing hour, the chances of finding her alive dwindled. Then, just as hope was slipping away, a local resident approached us. "I think I saw something strange near the old industrial site," he said nervously. "I heard noises last night, like someone was crying." My heart raced. "Can you show us?" We followed him to a desolate area on the outskirts of town, an abandoned warehouse similar to the one we had searched before. As we approached, I could hear muffled sounds, whispers, and cries. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Inside, the darkness swallowed us whole. My team spread out, and we began searching for the source of the sound. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach, hoping we weren't too late. Then I suddenly spotted a figure, tied up in the corner, a woman's form barely visible in the shadows. My heart dropped as I rushed forward. "Emily?" I quickly untied her, and her eyes widened with fear and relief. "Please help me," she cried, trembling. I pulled her close, checking her for injuries. "You're safe now," I assured her, relief flooding over me. My team quickly swept the area and we apprehended Mark, who had been hiding nearby, ready to escape. As he was led away in handcuffs, his expression shifted from smugness to despair. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "Not as much as you will," I replied, knowing this was just the beginning of the end for him. Once Emily was safe, we called for medical assistance. She was shaken, disoriented, but alive. As she was treated, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. We had found her just in time. Later, as I sat with Emily and Greg in the hospital, I could see the relief in their eyes. Emily was finally home, safe from the clutches of a man who had tried to steal her life. "I thought I would never see you again," Greg whispered, tears of relief streaming down his face. "I was so scared," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I wouldn't make it out alive." I knew that the road to recovery wouldn't be easy for either of them. The trauma of the experience would haunt them for years to come. But I also knew they had each other, and that bond would help them heal. As I left the hospital that night, I felt a sense of closure. The case was far from over, but we had brought Emily home. It was moments like these that reminded me of why I became a detective in the first place. There was still work to do. Mark would face charges and justice would be served. But for now, I could rest easy knowing that I had made a difference. The road ahead would be long, but with every step, I would fight for the victims, the unseen, and the stories that needed to be told. My name is Sarah Miller, and I've been a detective for over a decade. I've seen a lot in my line of work: murders, abductions, the darker side of humanity. But nothing could have prepared me for the case that would change everything I believed about justice. It all began one rainy afternoon when I received a call about a body found in the river. The weather had turned ugly, and the rain pounded against my car as I drove to the scene. I arrived at the riverbank, a muddy stretch of land flanked by trees where the police had set up a perimeter. The air was thick with tension, the smell of wet earth mingling with the metallic scent of impending death. The body had been pulled from the water, pale and bloated, face down as if it had just drifted, waiting to be discovered. I approached the medical examiner, who was already examining the scene. Drowned, he confirmed, but there was something in his tone that made me uneasy. I nodded and took a closer look at the corpse. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd. His hands were bound with duct tape, and there were bruises around his neck. Was this a homicide? I asked, my instincts kicking into gear. The medical examiner shrugged. Hard to tell. We'll know more after the autopsy. But those marks around his neck suggest he didn't drown by accident. As the scene began to clear, I felt a cold chill wash over me. This wasn't just a case of accidental drowning. This was murder. Back at the precinct, I dove into the victim's life. His name was Ethan Harrove, a local bartender with a reputation for being a nice guy. No criminal record, no known enemies. It was puzzling. I dug deeper, interviewing coworkers, friends, and family, trying to find any hint of trouble in his life. That's when I stumbled upon his ex-girlfriend, Lisa. She was still living in the area, and when I finally tracked her down, she was surprisingly open about their breakup. It was messy, she said, sitting across from me in a small coffee shop. Ethan was sweet, but he had a dark side. He started drinking too much after we split. I think he was trying to forget about me, or maybe he was just trying to escape. Escape from what? Pressed. From everything, she replied, her voice trembling. He had this thing he used to talk about, drowning, how he wanted to be free to let go of everything. I thought it was just talk, but I guess it wasn't. I left the coffee shop feeling more uneasy than ever. Lisa's words haunted me as I returned to my desk and pored over Ethan's social media accounts. Scrolling through his posts, I saw photos of him at the river, smiling with friends. But there were also dark messages scattered among the cheerful ones. Hints of despair hidden beneath a facade of normality. A few days later, I got a call from the medical examiner. Ethan's autopsy revealed the presence of alcohol in his system, but more troubling was the discovery of small amounts of a powerful sedative. He had been drugged before being drowned. I knew I was dealing with someone who had planned this murder carefully, someone who understood how to cover their tracks. I started digging into Ethan's past, looking for anyone who might have wanted him dead. As I followed leads, I kept coming back to a man named Jake, a local who had a history of violence and a known rivalry with Ethan at the bar. I arranged to meet him at a dive bar on the edge of town, hoping to catch him off guard. Jake was bigger than I expected, with tattoos snaking up his arms. He was sitting at the bar nursing a drink and looked up as I approached. "Detective," he said with a smirk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I have some questions about Ethan Harrove," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Ethan?" Jake laughed, but there was an edge to his voice. "What a loser. Always getting in over his head. And did you have anything to do with his death?" I asked, trying to gauge his reaction. "Me? Nah, man. That's not my style." He leaned back, his expression shifting from amusement to annoyance. "But I heard he was getting into some bad stuff. You know how it goes in this town. You mess with the wrong people, and you end up floating in the river." I narrowed my eyes. "What do you mean by bad stuff?" Jake leaned in, lowering his voice. "I heard he was into some heavy drugs, made some enemies along the way. You might want to look into that." It was a lead, but it felt like a dead end. I thanked Jake and left, determined to follow up on his words. But as I investigated further, I found no evidence to support his claims. The deeper I dug, the more it felt like Ethan had been trapped in a web of his own making. Weeks passed with no solid leads, and the case began to weigh heavily on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. Then, one evening as I was sifting through Ethan's social media once more, I noticed something strange. A series of messages he had sent to a mysterious account that had no name, just a string of numbers. Curiosity piqued. I reached out to my tech team for help tracing the account. Within hours, they had a hit. The account belonged to a user in a chat room known for dark conversations and discussions about taboo subjects, including drug use and self-harm. As I read through the messages, my heart raced. Ethan had been reaching out for help, but the replies were twisted and cruel, feeding his despair instead of helping him. He had been caught in a world far darker than I had imagined, and now it all made sense. I discovered the user's real name, Mark Anderson, a man with a record for online harassment and a history of drug-related offenses. I dug deeper and found that he had a connection to Jake, a business partner in a drug scheme that had turned ugly. I knew I was on to something, but I needed proof. The next day, I arranged a meeting with Mark. It wasn't easy, he was elusive and paranoid, but I finally managed to lure him into a diner on the outskirts of town. As I walked in, I spotted him in a booth, fidgeting nervously. He was younger than I expected, but the look in his eyes spoke of a life spent running from something. I slid into the booth across from him, keeping my tone calm and casual. "Mark, we need to talk about Ethan," I said. His expression darkened, and he leaned back, crossing his arms. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the crap," I replied, holding his gaze. "You and Ethan were in contact right before he died. I know about your online conversations. You fed into his worst fears." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the diner as if looking for an escape. "I didn't mean anything by it. It was just talk." "Just talk," I pressed, feeling the tension in the air. He was reaching out for help, and you pushed him further into the darkness. "I'm not here to play games, Mark. You need to tell me what happened." Mark's expression shifted, and for a moment, I thought he might crack. But then he steeled himself, pulling back into his shell. "I don't know what you want from me. I didn't kill him." "Maybe not directly," I said, frustration boiling over. "But you're part of a larger picture here. I need to know what happened the night he died." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "I don't want to get involved. Those guys are dangerous." "Then you'd better start talking," I said, my voice low, "because if you don't help me, I'll make sure everyone knows about your part in this." After a long silence, Mark finally spoke. Okay, but I swear I didn't do anything. I just sold him some drugs. He wanted to forget, you know? He was lost." "Where did you sell him the drugs?" I asked, sensing that I was getting somewhere. "At the river," he muttered. "He wanted to go there to think. I didn't think he'd actually drown." "Why was he tied up?" I pressed, but Mark shook his head. "I don't know. I wasn't there. He just wanted to escape, and I gave him what he wanted. That's all I know." I left the diner feeling more confused than ever. Mark's words echoed in my mind, but they didn't add up. How had Ethan ended up bound and drowned? This wasn't the end of the case. It was just the beginning. I decided to return to the river that night, hoping to find something I had missed before. The rain had stopped, and the air was cool and crisp. I walked along the bank, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, searching for clues in the shadows. As I moved closer to the water, I noticed something glimmering in the moonlight. A piece of jewelry, a simple silver bracelet, half buried in the mud. I bent down to pick it up and froze. The name engraved on it was unmistakable. Lisa. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Lisa had lied to me. She wasn't just an innocent ex-girlfriend. She had known more about Ethan's death than she had let on. And now it was clear that she had played a role in his murder. I had found the missing piece of the puzzle. It started out as just another day on the force. I'd been a detective for close to 15 years by then, and I had seen just about everything a person could see in this line of work. Robberies, murders, and enough broken families to last a lifetime. The job was wearing on me slowly but surely, but the case of a missing boy named David Mathers would change everything. David was a 10-year-old kid who lived in a small suburban neighborhood with his parents, Thomas and Michelle. On the surface, they were your typical family, middle-class, hard-working, keeping to themselves. They lived in a tidy white panel house with a well-maintained yard, the kind you pass by and don't give a second thought. But that would soon change. I got the call late in the evening. David had been reported missing for over 24 hours, and it wasn't like him to just disappear. His mother, Michelle, had called 911 after realizing he hadn't come home from school the previous day. No friends had seen him, and his teachers said he left school on time. I drove to their house, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. Missing kids, it was the kind of case that ate you up inside. I'd seen enough to know that if you don't find them within the first 48 hours, the chances of a happy ending drop to almost zero. When I arrived, Thomas and Michelle were already in full panic mode. Michelle was pacing the living room, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Thomas sat on the couch, his face pale, staring at the floor like he was trying to make sense of what had happened. As I introduced myself, I noticed a tension between them. Something unspoken that immediately caught my attention. "We've called everyone we know," Michelle said, her voice shaking. "His friends, neighbors, the school. No one's seen him since yesterday. I don't understand. He always comes home on time. Has he ever done this before?" I asked, jotting down notes in my notepad. "Never," Thomas replied, his voice low and tight. "David's a good kid. He doesn't wander off. Something's wrong." There was a brief silence. I could feel the weight of their fear filling the room. But beneath it was something else, something darker. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but I knew there was more to this than just a missing child. I spent the next few hours canvassing the neighborhood, talking to neighbors, teachers, and anyone who might have seen David. No one had seen him since the previous day. I combed through security camera footage from nearby houses, checked traffic cameras, but nothing. David had vanished without a trace. The next day, I brought in a search team. We scoured the nearby woods, parks, and fields. The search dogs picked up his scent near the edge of a forest, but it quickly disappeared, as if he had simply evaporated into thin air. With every hour that passed, the likelihood of finding him alive shrank. As the investigation continued, I kept coming back to the parents. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with them, especially Thomas. There was a coldness to him, a stiffness that felt rehearsed. Michelle was clearly distraught, but even her grief seemed strangely disconnected at times, as if she was suppressing something beneath the surface. I started digging deeper into their lives. From the outside, they appeared to be the picture-perfect family. Thomas had a steady job as an accountant, Michelle worked part-time as a nurse, and they were well-liked in the community. But as I looked closer, cracks began to appear. A neighbor mentioned that they had heard loud arguments coming from the Mathers house late at night, just a few weeks before David went missing. Another mentioned that David had been unusually quiet at school in the days leading up to his disappearance. I decided to pay Thomas another visit, this time without his wife present. I caught him as he was pulling into the driveway after work. He seemed tense, more so than before, and when I started asking him about their home life, his answers were vague, evasive. "How's your marriage?" I asked bluntly, watching his reaction. He paused, his jaw tightening. "We've had our problems, like any couple, but nothing serious." "What about David? Was he happy at home? Anything bothering him lately?" "He's just a kid," Thomas said, avoiding eye contact. "Kids go through phases." He stopped himself as if he had said too much. He hesitated. "He wasn't what?" Thomas glanced at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe guilt. It was hard to tell. "He wasn't acting like himself lately, but it was nothing serious." I pressed in further, but he clammed up. Something about the way he deflected made me more suspicious. I left the house that night with a gnawing sense of unease. Thomas was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what it was. A few days later, I interviewed Michelle alone. She was fragile, on the verge of breaking down. But as I started asking her more personal questions about her relationship with Thomas, about David's behavior, she seemed to withdraw. Her answers were short and hesitant. I noticed her hands were trembling, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her shirt. "Michelle," I said gently, "if there's anything you're not telling me, anything at all, now's the time to say it. This is about finding your son." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the kitchen where Thomas was sitting. She leaned in closer and whispered, "There were things I didn't want to see." "What things?" I asked, lowering my voice. "Thomas. He's not the man I thought he was," she said, her voice shaking. "He would get angry, especially with David." I tried to stop it, but he didn't listen. My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you mean by angry? Did he hurt David?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. "He tried to hide it, but there were bruises. David was so scared of him. I thought it would get better, but it didn't." I felt a surge of anger. This changed everything. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I was afraid," she whispered, barely able to speak through her sobs. "I thought I could fix it, but I thought I could protect David." I left the house that night with my mind racing. If Thomas had been abusing David, then maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a case of a child wandering off. Maybe Thomas had done something to his son. Something terrible. I obtained a search warrant for their house the next morning. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to follow every lead. As we combed through the house, I felt the tension building. The officers searched the basement, the garage, every room in the house, but we found nothing. Then one of the officers called me over to the backyard. It was a small space, mostly grass with a few scattered flower beds. The officer pointed to a patch of freshly turned soil near the back fence. "We found this," he said, his voice tense. "Looks like something was buried here." My stomach dropped. We started digging, the shovels cutting into the dirt with each thrust. My heart raced with every inch of soil we removed, until finally the shovel hit something solid. We cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing a small wooden box buried just a few feet underground. I knew what was inside before we even opened it. The smell hit us first. Decay. Rot. We pried the box open, and there, wrapped in an old blanket, was the body of David Mathers. I stood there, staring at the lifeless form of the boy, feeling a cold wave of anger wash over me. I had hoped, though I knew better, that we would find him alive. But now all hope was gone. We arrested Thomas on the spot. He didn't resist, didn't say a word as we cuffed him and led him away. But the look on his face, cold, emotionless. told me everything I needed to know. He had done this. He had killed his own son. In the interrogation room, Thomas finally cracked. Took hours, but eventually he confessed. They had been abusing David for years, beating him, berating him, making the boy live in constant fear. The night David disappeared, Thomas had lost control. They had gotten into an argument, and in a fit of rage, Thomas had hit him too hard. David's small body couldn't take it, and he died. Panicking, Thomas had wrapped his son's body in a blanket and buried him in the backyard, hoping no one would ever find out. He had thought he could cover it up, make it look like David had run away or been kidnapped. But his lies unraveled. Michelle was devastated, but in her grief, there was a strange sense of relief. She had been living in fear of her husband for years, and now that it was all out in the open, she didn't have to hide anymore. Thomas was sentenced to life in prison. He showed no remorse during the trial, no emotion as the judge read his sentence. It was a man who had buried his own son, not just in the ground, but in lies and fear, and now he would spend the rest of his life in a cage. As for me, I couldn't shake the image of that little wooden box from my mind. It haunted my dreams, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of doors. The case of David Mathers was one of the hardest I ever worked on, not because of the complexity, but because of the betrayal at its core. It was a case that showed me just how deeply people can bury their secrets, and how sometimes those secrets are far worse than anything we could ever imagine. I've been a detective for 14 years now, and I've seen my fair share of horrors. Yet, nothing ever prepared me for the unsettling, deeply disturbing case of Jessica Fisher. It started like so many missing person cases do, with a phone call from a concerned family member. Jessica was 28, a school teacher, and lived alone in a modest apartment. Her sister Amanda had called 911 after Jessica failed to show up for work and missed several family calls. It wasn't like her, Amanda had said. Jessica was reliable, always responsible. I agreed to look into it, assuming it was just a case of someone going off the radar for a few days. But I was wrong. Very wrong. I arrived at Jessica's apartment the following morning. It was a warm, sunny day, but something about the building felt cold. It was an old structure, its brick walls weathered and worn, with narrow hallways that seemed to press in on you. Jessica's apartment was on the 3rd floor, and as I walked up the creaky staircase, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. Her door was locked, but her car was parked out front, and there were no signs of forced entry. I knocked several times and called her name, but there was no answer. I had the superintendent let me in. The apartment was neat, almost obsessively so. Everything had its place. Books on the shelves alphabetized, dishes clean and stacked in the cabinets, clothes folded in the drawers. But despite the order, something felt off. There was a faint smell in the air, something sour and metallic. I walked through the rooms, calling out for Jessica. No response. Her bedroom was the last place I checked. I pushed the door open and felt my stomach lurch. The room was empty, but on the wall across from the bed was something that sent chills down my spine. Dozens of photos, black and white images of Jessica, were pinned to the wall. They weren't posed or taken by her. They were candid shots, clearly taken without her knowledge. Jessica walking to work, Jessica sitting in a cafe, Jessica in her apartment through the windows. Someone had been watching her closely. The photos had been arranged in a grid, almost meticulously, like a collage of obsession. At the center of the display was a single photo of Jessica sleeping in her bed. That photo was fresh, the ink barely dry. It was clear that whoever had been watching her had recently been inside her apartment. I stood there, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of it. My heart was pounding, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The case had shifted from a missing person to something far more sinister. I called for backup, and soon the apartment was crawling with officers and forensics. They dusted for prints, went through her belongings, but found nothing to indicate where Jessica might be or who had been watching her. The only clue we had were the photos on the wall, each one a testament to someone's sick obsession. Over the next few days, I interviewed her friends, coworkers, and neighbors. No one had seen anything unusual. Jessica was well-liked, kind, and lived a quiet life. She had no enemies, no known stalkers. Her sister Amanda was devastated, insisting that Jessica had never mentioned anything about feeling unsafe or being followed. I worked around the clock, piecing together Jessica's last known movements. She had been at school the day before she disappeared and gone home in the evening. There was nothing unusual about her day. No strange phone calls, no suspicious visitors. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. But the photos on the wall told a different story. Whoever had been watching Jessica had been doing it for a long time. The images spanned months, maybe even years. They knew her routine, her habits, her life, and now they had her. A week into the investigation, we got a break. A neighbor in the building next door had reported seeing a man lurking outside Jessica's apartment late at night. He was described as tall, wearing a hooded jacket, and had been standing by her window. The neighbor had seen him a few times, but hadn't thought much of it until the news about Jessica's disappearance broke. With this lead, we combed through nearby security footage, but it was slim. Most of the cameras in the area were outdated or poorly positioned. We found a few grainy images of a man in a hood walking near Jessica's building, but nothing that could identify him. Still, it was something, a shadowy figure, but no name, no motive, and no sign of Jessica. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every hour that passed felt like a countdown, and I knew that if we didn't find Jessica soon, we might never find her at all. I spent nights poring over the case file, staring at those photos of her, wondering who had taken them and where they were keeping her. 2 weeks in, something even more disturbing happened. Amanda called me in tears, saying she had received an envelope in the mail. Inside were more photos, new ones of Jessica. In these images, she was alive, but looked different. Her hair was disheveled, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes wide with fear. The photo showed her in what appeared to be a dark, windowless room, tied to a chair. In some of the pictures, she was looking directly at the camera, as if begging for help. The message was clear. Jessica was still alive, but whoever had her wanted us to know they were in control. I felt a wave of anger and helplessness wash over me. The sick bastard was playing a game, taunting us, showing us how close he was, how he could reach Jessica whenever he wanted. We traced the envelope, but it led to a dead end. It had been dropped in a mailbox on the other side of town, nowhere near the crime scene. I spent hours analyzing the photos, searching for any clues, anything that could tell us where Jessica was being held. But the room was bare. No identifiable objects, no windows, no visible landmarks. It was a void. Desperation started to creep in. We interviewed more people, followed every lead, but it felt like we were chasing a ghost. The person who took Jessica had covered their tracks well, leaving us nothing but those haunting photos. Then, 3 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, another envelope arrived at Amanda's house. This time it contained a single photo. Jessica's lifeless body, slumped in the same chair, her eyes closed, her skin pale and cold. The photo had been taken in the same dark room, but this time it was clear that she was dead. Amanda was inconsolable. I sat with her as she sobbed, holding the photo in my hands, feeling a mix of rage and sorrow. We had failed. Jessica was gone, and we had no idea who had done this or why. But the killer wasn't done. The next day, I received a letter at the precinct. Inside was a note, handwritten in jagged, uneven script. "You were too slow." The bastard was taunting me now, making it personal. I slammed my fist on the desk, cursing myself for not being faster, for not saving Jessica when we had the chance. For weeks I spiraled, couldn't let it go. The case consumed me, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I spent every waking hour trying to figure out who had taken her, who had killed her. The photos haunted me. The image of her dead body burned into my mind. Then one night, as I sat at my desk, staring at the wall of evidence I had collected, something clicked. I noticed a small detail in one of the earlier photos of Jessica, the one of her sitting in a cafe. In the background, reflected in the cafe's window, was a man. He was blurry, almost unrecognizable, but there was something about him that seemed familiar. I enlarged the image, studying it closely. The man's hood was pulled low over his face, but his build, his posture, it was the same as the figure we had seen in the security footage near her apartment. It was him, the stalker. I ran the image through our database, comparing it to known offenders, and finally I got a hit. The man's name was David Ross, a local loner with a history of voyeurism and stalking. He had never been charged with anything serious, but he had been reported several times for following women and taking photos of them without their knowledge. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. I had him. We tracked Ross to an old, rundown house on the outskirts of town. It was a decrepit place, hidden behind overgrown trees and weeds, far from prying eyes. As we approached, I felt my pulse quicken. I knew this was where he had taken Jessica. We raided the house, and what we found inside was worse than anything I had imagined. The place was a nightmare, a twisted shrine to his obsessions. There were hundreds of photos of Jessica pinned to the walls, covering every inch of space. Some of the photos were new ones we hadn't seen before, taken in the days leading up to her abduction. Ross had been watching her constantly, documenting her every move. In the basement, we found the room, the dark, windowless room from the photos. The chair was still there. The ropes used to bind her were discarded on the floor. It was a scene of pure horror, a place where Jessica had spent her final days in terror, waiting for a rescue that never came. Ross wasn't there. He had fled, but we knew we were close. After a 2-day manhunt, we finally caught him hiding in an abandoned warehouse. He confessed to everything. The stalking, the abduction, the murder. He had been obsessed with Jessica for years, watching her, fantasizing about her. When he finally took her, it was because he couldn't stand the thought of anyone else having her. I sat across from him in the interrogation room, staring into his cold, lifeless eyes. He had no remorse, no regret. To him, Jessica was just an object, something he had owned. And when he was done with her, he had discarded her like trash. I couldn't bring Jessica back, but I could make sure Ross never saw the light of day again. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But even with him behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed her. Jessica's case was the darkest chapter of my career, a reminder of the monsters that walk among us, unseen until it's too late. It's a case that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face, hear her silent screams, and I know that no matter how many cases I solve, I'll never forget the one I couldn't save.